Welcome to Business Insight. I'm Peter Marks. My guest is Wendy Murphy. She's an associate professor from Babson College. She's also the co-author of a new book, Strategic Relationships at Work. And we're going to be talking about the book today. Wendy, pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me today, Peter.
Tell me first, what prompted you to write the book?
Well, actually, my research for the past 10, 15 years, we've known in the scholarly world that traditional mentoring relationships are not the best way to move careers forward. And in fact, two facts really prompted the writing of the book. One was that we know, based on the research, that informal mentoring relationships have historically been more effective than formal mentoring relationships. And two, we know that multiple relationships are really the model that organizations and individuals should be taking to further their career development. So those two facts combined with the fact that we've known about this for about 15 years in the scholarly literature and it just didn't seem to be making it out there into the practitioner space really prompted the writing of the book.
Well, I want to come back to those, but first, tell us a little about the history of mentoring.
So the history of mentoring is actually quite long. The word mentor actually comes from Greek mythology, the story of the Trojan War and Odysseus leaving his son Telemachus and asking Athena, the goddess, to take the form of mentor and shepherd Telemachus into adulthood.
Well, we're going to get a lot of culture in here.
And so that idealized form of mentor has sort of existed in our culture for many, many years. But in the 70s, a scholar named Daniel Levinson wrote a book called Seasons of a Man's Life. And in his work, he found that one of the crucial distinguishing factors for men who had very successful careers was having a mentor in the workplace. Now, these were, of course, informal mentoring relationships. My co-author, Kathy Cram, then did her dissertation work with Daniel Levinson as her advisor, and she wrote the book Mentoring at Work in 1985. So in the 1980s, when companies were booming and women were becoming fully integrated into the workforce, companies saw mentoring as an opportunity to advance women and minorities' careers and sort of formalize this idea of mentoring relationships.
Now, you mentioned earlier that informal is better than formal when it comes to mentoring. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, there's a couple of principles that really explain why informal relationships work better. The first is a principle from sociology called homophily. We tend to be attracted to people who are more similar to us, who have similar values, that look like us, talk like us, have similar experiences, so that chemistry is automatic. Whereas when you try to formalize a relational process, it takes the chemistry out of the equation, and so lots of formal programs have to do a lot of training to get that spark in the relationship. So that's one reason. The other reason is that people tend to seek out, from a mentor perspective, people seek out people they see that have potential or need their help. And from a protege perspective, we seek out people we admire naturally. And so there's already a reason for us to be interacting. Whereas when you try to formalize that, you're kind of trying to match people without all of that automatic data.
That leads into what you said before about multiple mentor relationships. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, the world has changed. In the past 30 years, we've seen a dramatic change in how people enact careers. So 30 years ago, you could enter an organization and you could stay with the same company for 30, 40 years, retire, get the gold watch, the pension, all of that. With the changing times, the economy changing, the average 30-year-old changes careers 3 to 5 times before they figure out what they exactly want to do. We know that careers are becoming what we'd call more boundaryless. And what that means is that people are taking a self-directed approach to their career. And so when you think about that and you think about the amount of support you would need across a career to both navigate those changes and to get the sort of advice you need in order to move yourself forward, then you need to access multiple resources. Good developmental relationships offer 4 sort of types of support in all. They help you get your work done. They help you navigate advancing in your career. They provide personal, what we call psychosocial support, and they provide role modeling. Well, all those things used to be encompassed in what we'd call a traditional mentor. That's the wise sort of sage that you'd seek out. That's really hard for one person to encompass all of those things. And so why not distribute your resources? Don't put all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, because frankly, what happens when that one person leaves the organization? You need support from multiple people, probably at different points in your career and across the different decisions and everyday challenges that you face.
Now, I want to learn about how you get them, but first, I understand why it's a benefit to the mentee. Why is this a benefit to the mentor and the organization?
So that's actually the best part, is that research time and again has shown that it's not just the mentees and the proteges that benefit from these relationships, the mentors do as well. So not only do they get increased career satisfaction, but mentors also, you see mentors having higher salaries, getting promoted faster, feeling a sense of generativity and giving back to the next generation, being more committed to their organization because they're feeling like they have an impact, but also getting a reputation for developing others. And that could be one of the most critical factors for organizations now in terms of thinking, well, who should the next leaders be in this organization?
Now, back to the informal, it seems hard enough to get one mentor. How does one get multiple mentors?
Well, in part, in writing this book, part of what we were trying to do is to take that mentor word out of the equation and call people developers. And when you think about people as developers, instead of putting them up on this pedestal, you can see that there's lots of opportunities for development. The very definition of a developmental relationship is a learning relationship. And there are a couple of ways that you learn. One is you learn by excelling in tasks and getting actual work done, and the other is personal learning and interpersonal skills, communication, getting support that way. So there's lots of relationships in the workplace that you could rely on for those things. One of the most underutilized resources in most people's lives and careers is their peers. So peers can be great resources for learning new things, particularly those peers that are a step ahead of you, that are right 1 year or 2 years ahead of you. But also, I tell my students this in particular, your peers that are in lateral positions in different parts of the organization have different information than you do. And so accessing that unique information, and by the way, they're easier to access than the really senior leaders, is a really great, useful tool for you. When we think about sponsorship, which is that function where people say, oh, he or she is really good, we should promote him or her. That's the function that you really need more senior people for. And so those people, you should be targeting at least 2 or 3 senior leaders in your organization in terms of getting some visibility, having your name known, getting to know them in any way that you can, and working with your direct supervisor to get that sort of exposure so you have the opportunity to have those relationships.
When you've got a peer as your mentor, and of course it could go both ways, does everybody know they're your mentor? In other words, certainly if you have somebody higher up in the organization, you kind of have a sense if somebody's mentoring, but when you're talking about a peer, how would that work?
Well, a lot of times the term peer coaching is more user-friendly for people, and that's part of why we call these developmental networks. We don't necessarily call them mentoring networks because that lexicon feels really stilted and feels like it should be that formal relationship. I think when you take the word mentor out and you just focus on learning relationships, people are more amenable and more likely to recognize when they're getting those resources from their peers at work.
Now, for the organization that wants to foster this, whether it's formal or informal, what do they do? What kind of things should they be thinking about, planning, structuring? What, if you were advising the CEO of a company and saying, hey, mentoring would be a good thing throughout your organization, what would you tell them?
Well, there's a couple things organizations can think about in order to foster a developmental culture, because that's really what we're talking about. One is their reward systems. So are your annual review processes giving people credit for developing others? Because people aren't going to put the time into relationship building and teaching and learning from others if they're not getting rewarded for that. We know that from basic motivation theory and literature. You can't reward A when asking for B. So the reward systems are very important. Also, the expectations of the leaders. So are the leaders serving as role models? Are they developing their direct reports? What sort of signals are they sending to their direct reports and to their and beyond that developing others is important? Do they make time for it? Are they willing to share their personal stories, share both their strengths and their weaknesses with those that they're developing so others can learn from their experience?
What is an example of a company that you think has a culture that tends to be good for fostering these type of things?
A company that you wouldn't typically think of, Sodexo actually has a really strong mentoring culture, and they do it in a couple of ways. They do it through formal mentoring relationships with diverse pairings, but they also do it through their training processes. So they have a lot of mechanisms in place to help support a developmental culture.
Does it matter the type of company, manufacturing versus personal services versus, whatever?
Well, I think different employees may need different resources, and so tailoring the formal offerings and the informal reward systems as well as the formal reward systems to the type of business that you have is just smart.
One of the articles you cite is called "Women Are Over-Mentored and Under-Sponsored." What is that all about?
So that comes out of research by the Catalyst organization in New York and Herminia Ibarra's work over at INSEAD. And what they're talking about is this idea that in the formal mentoring world, we've seen a lot of programs that benefit women. And oftentimes women are getting all of those functions from those relationships, but they're not getting enough sponsorship, which is a key function of career support. And that sponsorship is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, that their voices are being heard at the upper levels, and the leaders in the C-suite are raising their names as for key jobs and key roles and key promotions. So getting more women into leadership positions requires more sponsors of women, because we all know those informal processes are keys for people moving up in organizations.
Social media, clearly it's changing everything. How is it changing mentoring today, and how do you think it will in the future?
Well, for one thing, if your network is important. Developmental networks are a subset of your overall network. So what's interesting about networks is that in the face-to-face world, most of us have an average of about 150 connections. In a typical developmental network, that subset of relationships, we'd expect in early career, people tend to have 3 to 5. In mid-career, they creep up 10, 12, sometimes even 15. But in social media world, you can have hundreds, thousands of relationships. So it's about curating your social media relationships and really making an effort to get to know people beyond just the electronic format, I think. But what's interesting is the electronic format can be quite effective for mentoring. It depends on the quality of interaction rather than just the quantity or even the medium.
That's an interesting question. When I think of social media, I think of really communicating as opposed to relating. But you think that it can work for relating in this context?
I think it does work in this context.
Yeah.
Companies like Triple Creek, their software River actually encourages learning communities, and they basically call them mentoring communities, where people come together around a specific topic and they teach one another what they know, and they search for other resources, and then once they get everything that they need, they'll shut those communities down. And I think that's a form of group mentoring, really. My own experience with social media, when I had my first webinar to give, I looked around at my LinkedIn network, because nobody in my immediate relational field had experience giving webinars. I found someone who'd given a webinar, reached out to her, she didn't respond. Found someone else, she responded, we had lunch, she gave me a whole bunch of resources. I gave my webinar, we met afterwards, and I continued to talk to her. That was a mentoring moment, and in fact, she's become part of my developmental network. And it was completely initiated via social media.
Wow. Well, this is a fascinating area for people that want to learn more. Here's the book, Strategic Relationships at Work. For Business Insight, I'd like to thank Wendy Murphy from Babson College. I'm Peter Marks. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.